Hello, this is Pastor Paul Brunton from the Jesus Movement. Welcome. I'm just on the beginning of Lesson 5, God, Paganism and the Ancient Civilisations, as part of my series on a journey to faith. In this lesson, we're going to take a slight departure from the journey we've been on so far, the journey which has seen Abraham leave the ancient city of Ur, head up to Haran, where he also left his father behind, Terah, and down into the land of Canaan, where he received the covenant promise from God, and then travelled further to Egypt as a result of a drought, where he was to lose his wife Sarai to the Pharaoh. Having recovered his wife from the Pharaoh, when God helped him and kept his side of the covenant, Abraham returned back to the land of Canaan, where he separated from his nephew Lot, who went to herd his animals on the plains of Jordan at the bottom of the Dead Sea, and Abraham went to Mamre, next to today's Hebron, where he remained at that point in time. So on this particular lesson, we're going to have a look at this ancient civilization at the time, and the reason we're going to have a look at that is because in the Bible we read about the many ancient idols that people worshipped at the time, and we read such statements as the words abomination, that they were disgusting to God, that he warned his people not to worship any of these false gods. He warned his people not to intermarry with these people because of the influence to worship foreign gods, etc. So I'm going to take you on a journey today to have a look at who all of these false idols were, or other words for them are, foreign gods or other gods. And I'm just going to explore some of the main idols in the Bible, so that you can have an understanding of who they actually were, where they came from, and what people actually believed, and why they actually worshipped these ancient idols. Now, the Holy Bible and the archaeological record establishes that Abraham was called out from a world that was full of polytheism. Now, polytheism is the worship of more than one God, hence the word poly, theistic, meaning the worship of God. Put together, that word is polytheism. We know that after God appeared to Abraham, he began a monotheistic relationship to worship him and no other. Again, that word mono and theistic, so the worship of one God. And even though the Holy Bible focuses on Abraham because God called him out to make a people of his own, it also reveals that God spoke to other people. Now, monotheism was not practiced during the time of Abraham. Societies were polytheistic and worshipped numerous gods. But there was also some people who were what we call henotheistic. And what this means is that they worshipped other gods or foreign gods or household gods at the same time as worshipping the living God, our Lord Almighty, who is our Creator God who lives in heaven. Now, when we read the Old Testament, we can know how many generations of God's people abandoned him, or in fact practiced henotheism, both before and after the time of Abraham. As this is not tolerated by God, the Holy Bible reveals his wrath or his anger, and the consequences have been recorded in history and are found in the archaeological record. When we believe in God as Creator, we believe that all of creation came forth at the free and sovereign command of God. Now, ancient civilizations saw the God of Abraham and his descendants as yet just another God. So in the Bible, we can read how God is described in Genesis 24:7, for example, the God of heaven, or in Genesis chapter 14, verse 18, the Most High God. And again in Genesis chapter 14, but this time verse 19, he's described as a Most High God who made heaven and earth. So if ancient civilizations saw the God of Abraham not as God the creator of all, but simply the God of heaven, as in another astral deity. Now, many different gods in these ancient times were named after a variety of forces or natural objects. So obviously when we're talking about the God of heaven, that means that they would have looked at them the same as the god Nana, for example, who was the moon god, or the god Shamash, who was known as the sun god. So there is a difference, obviously, there, that they believe that these individual gods were the same as Abraham's God of heaven. Now, deification is the process of creating gods and goddesses, and it didn't stop at the physical observation of nature, but expanded to cover all manner of the human experience. Things such as love, fertility, war, food harvest, hunting, and many other things. But to believe in God, we require faith. Those who don't have faith believe what their senses say, and there's such things as sight, sound, smell, and touch. As you might have heard or even said yourself, I'll believe it when I see it. So we're talking about tangible belief as opposed to faith, which is something that we cannot necessarily see. Now, these people, they make their own gods and they give them powers and titles. The Holy Bible tells us, despite experiencing the Most High God, that Abraham's descendants will choose to worship false gods made out of wood and stone. But in order to come to faith in God, mankind cannot worship any form of false god. When Jesus Christ was born in the flesh, Greek and Roman gods were still worshipped in the region of Judea. But Christianity did not start because of this Gentile, non-Jewish idol worship. Christianity started because God's people, even after they had stopped worshipping idols, were out of relationship with God. They obeyed his laws, but they failed his heart. People could follow the law, but still be unkind, self-righteous, and hypocritical. They failed to understand that the kingdom of God was one of service and love. The presence of Jesus in the physical human form, capable of using divine powers to perform miracles, not only demonstrated his divinity, but also revealed God's love for his people. Jesus taught there was no place for the law without love. Put to death only to rise again, Jesus showed through his resurrection there was only one truly divine living God who could overcome death to rise again. This gives us hope, for there is life after death. For God's chosen people, the Jews, this fulfilled the prophecy of the coming Messiah, whether they accept it or not. For the Gentiles, this enabled them to understand that all of their false gods were powerless to perform miracles of healing, were unable to raise the dead to life, and most certainly were incapable of love. This enabled those without faith, who can only believe in what their senses tell them, to come to faith through Jesus, the Son of God. Jesus was born to the son of Jewish parents. His life until he was crucified was focused on his own people. However, after fulfilling Isaiah's prophecy and rising from the dead, the lack of faith from the Jewish people led Jesus to bring a new covenant to all people. Jesus instructed his disciples to bring all people to God, Jew and Gentile alike. You can read about this in the book of Matthew, and specifically the chapter 28, verse 19. Now, when differentiating from God from a false god, by common words and language, it's difficult. And the reason for this is because the word El, spelt E-L, is actually a Semitic word that was used to describe God. But it was also used to describe any other generic god in ancient history. The word basically means deity. It was used by the Canaanites and other religions of the Levant. Now, the Levant is the eastern side of the Mediterranean, which will come up in the lessons, and that includes the top of Egypt, today's Israel, Lebanon, part of Syria, and around the top into the base of Turkey. So that whole eastern curved area of the Mediterranean is what we know as the Levant. Now, in the Tanakh, which is the Hebrew Bible, Elohim is the normal word used for God. This form of El is also used, but less prevalent, as is the name Yahweh. Now, Yahweh means he causes to be or he creates, so it speaks of God as the creator. All three refer to Abraham's God, the God of Israel. But early post-biblical times, the name Yahweh was no longer pronounced, so modern Judaism replaced it with the word Adonai, which means Lord. Christianity also replaced the word Yahweh with Lord, and hence, when we read our Bible today, you see the prevalent use of the word Lord. From the time of Abraham, God became a personal God. He made a covenant with Abraham and promised his divine protection. The word personal is used to reflect the direct nature of the relationship between God and Abraham, as there is no mediation by prophets or priests. In the ancient Near East, gods were not unique and were shared throughout the region. However, God's covenant that protected Abraham's people was unique. Understanding the difference between the true living God and false gods in which vile acts were committed by societies at the time, we can understand why God was so repulsed and angry at those who abandoned faith in him and how history is shaped directly as a result. The ancient beliefs of Abraham's descendants through his son Isaac will see the Israelites live in Egypt. It will see them occupy the land of Canaan, and they will see them battle their neighbours and become vassal states of the Assyrians, the Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, and then the Romans. For 2,000 years, beginning with the call of Abraham, God's people will abandon him repetitively for idolatrous worship of false gods. Many will practice henotheism and worship other gods simultaneously with the God of Israel, and God will punish them when they are wicked and prosper them when they are faithful. It is an extraordinary journey that is completed with the death, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus Christ. A new covenant replaces the old, and all people are given the opportunity to be restored in a faithful relationship with God. The legacy is the difference of two religions that we know today. One, of course, is called Judaism, and the other we know as Christianity. Both love the same God, but one still awaits the fulfillment of the messianic prophecies, while the other awaits the second return. When God scattered the people who built the Tower of Babel, they were out of relationship with him, but when Abraham was called by God, he was the first to turn away from the worship of false idols people had created to replace him. So we're talking about 10 generations of people from the time that Noah came to rest at Mount Ararat after the Great Flood. Now, Abraham's journey to faith was the first step of God's plan to reunite the scattered races. So we can ask the question, if the God of Abraham is the one true living God, how can we tell when someone is talking about the one true God? The answer to this is really important, and it can be found in Paul's letter to the Romans when he writes about pagans. Now, you can find this in the book of Romans in the New Testament of your Bible, and I'm going to read from chapter 1 and verses 19 to 21. And it reads, "Since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them, for since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God, nor gave thanks to him. But their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like mortal man, and birds and animals and reptiles. They exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and worshipped and served things rather than the Creator." Now, Paul says we can perceive God's truth from creation. We don't see God as a separate created image, as God's eternal power and divine nature is obvious from the world around us. God created all that exists, whereas man created false gods to represent aspects of God's creation. For 4,000 years, nations, leaders, and false gods have come and gone, but today we still worship the God of Abraham, so clearly God is eternal. God the Creator creates life. In Genesis chapter 2 verse 7, it says, "He breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being." But the makers and worshippers of idols and false gods choose death instead. And in the second book of Kings, chapter 16, verse 3, we can read about how man sacrificed his son in the fire. So this is speaking about the kings themselves. So we have these two different outlooks. One, that God breathes life into people to make them a living being. And secondly, that people who make false gods were prepared to sacrifice their own sons in fire and to burn them to death in the sense that they're going to appease angry false gods to improve the circumstances in their life. Now, when Abraham was born, he was raised to worship these false gods. The worship of false gods was prevalent throughout all ancient civilizations. Human sacrifices were made in their name. In the Holy Bible, there are many of these gods or idols that are usually called foreign gods from the land of Canaan or surrounding neighbours. So before we continue this journey to faith, I'm going to take a look at some of the most prevalent gods or idols and where they're found in the Holy Bible. So let's understand what acts were committed in their name by those who worship them and why God described them as an abomination. In the book of Jeremiah, God said, "Nor did it enter my mind that they," so he's talking about the Israelites, "should do such a detestable thing." And that can be found in Jeremiah chapter 32, verse 35. So I'm going to now go to the first slide for this lesson, and we're going to have a look at the first of these gods, which I'm going to reveal to you that are found in the Holy Bible to give you some insight and understanding as to who they were and what people believed and why they worshipped them. So I'm just going to pop on this first slide, and the first god that we're going to have a look at, false god, is Ammon. Now Ammon is also known or spelt Amun, which is spelled A-M-U-N. Now Amun was a local deity of thieves in Egypt from the time of Abraham. He was worshipped as a god of creation, able to create himself and then his surroundings. Thebes was the Greek name for the city of Wasset in ancient Egypt, and it is found on the east bank of the Nile River within the modern city of Luxor. Called Ammon in the Holy Bible, this god was historically recorded as Amun, as I've mentioned, and Ammon was elevated to national importance when the people of Thebes overthrew the Hyksos, which were foreign rulers thought to be from the land of Canaan. Now they'd ruled over their region in the eastern Nile Delta, and perceived to be powerful after this victory, this god was then fused with the sun god Ra, and known thereafter as Amun-Ra, or the king of the gods. Now if you have a look at those pictures there that are on the slide, there's three different pictures. On the far side you'll see the metallic little statue, and that's a statue or a what you could call an idol or a household idol of this false god. Beside that is a inscription or hieroglyphic carving that's found in the walls of the temples, and beside me there is a picture of an illustration of this same god. Now in 609 BC, Pharaoh Necho II of Egypt led an army north to join the Assyrian Emperor Ashur-uballit II in a battle against the future king of Babylonia, Nebuchadnezzar. On his way north, Josiah, the Israelite king of the southern kingdom of Judah, confronted him when he tried to take his army through his kingdom. Forced to engage in battle, Pharaoh Necho II killed King Josiah, but lost time and arrived late to support the Assyrians in battle. Jehoahaz was freely elected to replace his father as the new king of Judah, but Pharaoh Necho II had other ideas and deposed him. Placing his brother Jehoiakim on the throne, he forced the king of Judah to become a vassal state of Egypt, requiring them to pay what they used to call tribute, what we know today as taxes. Eventually joining the Assyrians to lay siege to Haran, which is the place where Abraham left his father Terah, they failed and regrouped at a place called Hamath in Syria. In 605 BC, the Assyrian and Egyptian allies fought the Babylonians again at Carchemish, but their armies were decimated after the Assyrian Empire ended. Pharaoh Necho II returned to Egypt with a remnant of his army and took Jehoahaz with him. The kingdom of Judah became a vassal state of the emerging New Babylonian Empire, and they were required to pay tribute or taxes to King Nebuchadnezzar II. Now, King Nebuchadnezzar II continued to expand his empire, and he kept trying to invade Egypt, but he was unsuccessful for 3 years. King Jehoiakim foolishly switched sides back to Egypt because he believed the kingdom of Judah could rebel against the Babylonians, who couldn't defeat Egypt. He was then subsequently killed after Nebuchadnezzar II invaded the kingdom of Judah and laid siege to Jerusalem. This account explains how God used the Babylonians to punish the people of Judah. In the book of Jeremiah, chapter 44, verse 5, he said, "They did not turn from their wickedness or stop burning incense to other gods." So it's revealed that God used one nation to punish another who worshipped these false gods. In Jeremiah chapter 46, verses 25 to 26, it says very specifically, "I am about to bring punishment on Ammon, god of Thebes, on Pharaoh, on Egypt and her gods and her kings, and on those who rely on Pharaoh. I will hand them over to those who seek their lives, to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylonia, and his officers." So understanding that Ammon changed from the local deity of Thebes to the national king of gods following success at war, when Egypt made the kingdom of Judah and other nations vassal states, it further empowered Egyptian people to believe their success came from their god's power. Defeat had the opposite effect, however, because it demonstrated that their god was weak, and so God used the Babylonians to defeat the Egyptians. This effectively turned both nations into his vassal states and demonstrated that the only one true God, the God of Abraham, the God of Israel, had any power. Now, in Egyptian mythology, when Ammon was worshipped in Thebes, he represented the concept or element of air or invisibility, and later became known as a wind deity. The name Ammon reflects this belief as it means hidden. Ancient Egyptian Thebans believed that Ammon first created himself and then his surroundings, so clearly this belief is offensive to God the Creator, as this false idol is attributed with the same ability to create. Perceived to forcefully end Hyksos rule as the regional god from Thebes, when Ammon was elevated to national importance and fused with the sun god Ra, he was also fused with the god of fertility and creation called Min, so Ammon-Ra became characterized as a solar god, a creator god, and a fertility god. He was also deemed to be the champion of the poor, or troubled and central to personal piety. When his popularity grew, he became known as the king of gods, and this is reflected historically because from amongst many different Egyptian gods, he is the most widely recorded of them all. Okay, so we're going to move on and we're going to have a look at another false god. This time, we're going to have a look at the goddess called Asherah. Now, Asherah was a consort of El, who was the chief god of Canaan. Accepted as a sea goddess, she was also worshipped for fertility. Priests of both gender, male and female, performed public fertility rites to mimic both El and Asherah. So-called sacred prostitution went much further, though, for these holy prostitutes, both priests and priestesses of this cult, were made available to worshippers in the belief their sexual copulation would increase fertility for both people and land. Now, on the pictures there on the slide beside me, the main picture, you can see a gathering of people there. There's a statue standing upright with a female holding her breasts, and there is a risen platform with other false gods in there, and you can see a naked male and female holding hands together there. Now, they're about to enact a fertility rite of El, and it's to demonstrate El, who is the god, and Asherah as the goddess, in the presence of other pagan gods and worshippers. So you can just imagine this scene. These couple are about to perform sex in public, and there's also other priests and priestesses available there who are going to do the same. Now, the other picture that's on this page shows an actual idol, a household god, where once again it's a bit more crude and rudimentary, but you can see the upper half shows those two hands holding those breasts. Now, that's a symbol of fertility in ancient times, because from the breast, of course, is expressed milk, which is used to feed the young. So we can get a picture here that these public sexual rites are obviously something which are quite disturbing and abhorrent to God, and yet this is something that was common practice in these ancient days. Now, wooden poles known as asherim were placed in Asherah's honour near other pagan objects of worship. So that tall statue that I've already mentioned in the picture is actually carved from wood, and it's known as an asherim. Now, prior to the people of Israel entering the land of Canaan, God actually said to Moses in Exodus chapter 34, verse 12 to 14, "Be careful not to make a treaty with those who live in the land where you are going, or they will be a snare among you. Break down their altars, smash their sacred stones, and cut down their Asherah poles. Do not worship any other god, for the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God." So in that picture, you can there see what an actual Asherah pole is, and it's that carving of that female form standing upright, holding her breasts. Now, prevalent throughout Canaan, God forewarned his people, but soon after they settled into the promised land, they forsook their Lord and served the idols of Asherah and Baal. In Judges chapter 3, verse 7, it says, "The Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. They forgot the Lord their God and served the Baals and the Asherahs." Now, the history and development of the Israelites was very poor after invading Canaan. Even though God raised up leaders called judges to administer his laws, society was often steeped in lawlessness and the worship of other gods. The goddess Asherah is often worshipped together with Baal, for not only were they prevalent in the land, but they were worshipped as chief or main deities amongst a pantheon of lesser gods. Although God Almighty was the sovereign ruler of the Israelites, lawlessness in the land led his people to request an earthly monarchy during the time of the last judge Samuel, which you can read about in the book of Samuel chapter 8, verses 1 to 22. Now God allowed this, but then many of the Israelite kings either allowed or led their people to worship other gods. God punished them severely. Ironically, they were led off in captivity by foreign powers who actually worshipped these foreign gods. Now, an illustration of this disobedience is evidenced when King Ahab, who ruled the northern kingdom of Israel between 874 to 854 BC, built a temple for the worship of Baal in his capital city at Samaria. In the first book of Kings, chapter 16, verse 32 to 33, it says, "He set up an altar for Baal in the temple of Baal that he built in Samaria. Ahab also made an Asherah pole and did more to provoke the Lord." The influence for this came from disobeying another of God's commands, which you can find in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 3 to 4 in the Old Testament. And it reads, "Do not intermarry with them. Do not give your daughters to their sons or take their daughters for your sons, for they will turn your sons away from following me to serve other gods." King Ahab's wife, Jezebel, was the daughter of King Ethbaal of Sidon, a woman raised to worship Baal. So Sidon is in the Phoenician coast, and so that's just at the top north of the ancient kingdom of Israel. Now God sent his prophet Elijah to warn King Ahab that a severe drought would grip the northern kingdom of Israel as a punishment for leading his people to worship these gods. A devastating drought did strike, and King Ahab's wife Jezebel retaliated by killing all of God's prophets except Elijah, who they couldn't find. In the third year of the drought, Elijah again confronted the king, and he said, "You have abandoned the Lord's commands and have followed the Baals. Now summon the people from all over Israel to meet me on Mount Carmel. Bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table." This you can read in the first book of Kings, chapter 18, verse 18 to 19. When the prophets of Asherah and Baal came, Elijah challenged them to demonstrate the power of their gods. They failed, but God didn't fail Elijah, and by his request, the people of Israel put the false prophets to death. Now this example shows us the sheer scale of worship of other gods. King Ahab built a majestic place of worship for Baal. There were 850 prophets, and though not mentioned, there would be a vast body of priests and priestesses to perform rites. This society was heavily involved in the worship of false gods. As with the Egyptians who worshipped the god Amun, God used a foreign power to punish the north kingdom of Israel. They were overrun by the Assyrian emperor Shalmaneser V, who took them into captivity. Now the Holy Bible gives us an insight into the worship of other gods. The Israelites secretly did things against the Lord, their God, that were not right. From watchtower to fortified city, they built themselves high places in all their towns. They set up sacred stones and Asherah poles on every hill and under every spreading tree. At every high place they burnt incense as the nations whom the Lord had driven out before them had done. You can read about that in the second book of Kings, chapter 17, verses 9 to 11. Furthermore, from the second book of Kings again, chapter 17, this time verses 16 to 17, it says, "They forsook all the commands of the Lord their God and made for themselves 2 idols cast in the shape of calves and an Asherah pole." So there's that Asherah pole again. "They bowed down to all the starry hosts, and they worshipped Baal. They sacrificed their sons and daughters in the fire. They practiced divination and sorcery, and sold themselves to do evil in the eyes of the Lord, provoking him to anger." So God used the Assyrians to punish the 10 tribes of Israel that formed the northern kingdom of Israel. This left only 2 tribes in the southern kingdom of Judah. And again from the second book of Kings, chapter 17, this time verse 18, it says, "So the Lord was very angry with Israel and removed them from his presence. Only the tribe of Judah was left." Now, although the southern kingdom of Judah didn't suffer an unbroken succession of kings who led them to worship other gods, some did abandon God completely. Some were faithful, but permitted others to worship idols, and some were completely faithful and abolished idol worship altogether. The reign of King Manasseh from 687 to 643 BC over the kingdom of Judah can be likened to King Ahab. The result of his reign had the same outcome, future captivity. The difference, however, is that this time it was by the Babylonians. He went down the same path as King Ahab and defiled the house of the Lord, the temple of Jerusalem. He rebuilt the high places his father Hezekiah had destroyed. He also erected altars to Baal and made an Asherah pole, as Ahab, king of Israel, had done. He bowed down to all the starry hosts and worshipped them. He built altars in the temple of the Lord, of which the Lord had said, "In Jerusalem I will put my name." In both courts of the temple of the Lord, he built altars to all the starry hosts. He sacrificed his own son in the fire, practiced sorcery and divination, and consulted mediums and spiritists. He took the carved Asherah pole he had made and put it in the temple. Now that reads from the second book of Kings, from chapter 21, verses 3 to 7. So we can see that once again the Asherah as a goddess was worshipped. The actual Asherah pole was constructed, and in fact they actually placed it in the temple of Jerusalem, God's holy place. Now the worship of Asherah contributed much to the downfall of the divided kingdoms of Israel. In Canaanite mythology, Asherah was the consort of both El and Baal. El was associated with a source of fresh water, so Asherah as his consort was identified mainly as a sea goddess, but also with fertility. During the period of the monarchies in Israel's history, often mentioned in the Holy Bible together, Asherah was the goddess at the side of Baal. In Canaanite mythology, Asherah sometimes appeared to be a fierce opponent of Baal when she thought other members of the pantheon challenged her authority or influence, or if Baal preferred Anath, who was another one of these ancient goddesses, instead of Asherah as his sexual partner. Incredibly, this conflict between Baal and Asherah was used as an explanation for why the Mediterranean climate underwent 2 seasons each year in the region. Excuse me. Now, the next goddess that we're going to have a look at is a goddess by the name of Ashtoreth. So I'm just going to pop up the next slide there. Now, Ashtoreth was also known as Astarte and was a goddess that was popular in quite a few different cultures. She was worshipped as an astral deity linked with the evening star and as a goddess of fertility, sexuality, and war. Like Asherah, a public fertility rite was enacted by a priest and priestess to emulate Ashtoreth as a consort of Baal, engaging in an act of sexual copulation. Holy prostitutes, both priests and priestesses of this cult, were also made available to worshippers for sexual copulation to increase their fertility. The Holy Bible also speaks of Ashtoreth in conjunction with Baal as a major god, and in Judges chapter 10 verse 6 It says the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. They served the Baals and the Ashtoreths. The prophets denounced her worship many times, but although warned not to worship other gods, the Israelites who arrived in the land of Canaan also worshipped this goddess called Ashtoreth. And if you have a look at the statue there, it's actually very small. So this would be a household idol. And if you have a look at it, you'll see on the top of the hair on the head of this idol, there is actually the crescent moon. So that's that aspect of the evening star. And once again, they're connecting objects of God's creation as the item that's actually being worshipped. So that's some symbolism there that you can see for yourself. Now, archaeologists, they verify that Ashtoreth, or Astarte, she's sometimes known as, must have been a very popular goddess, because there's many of these nude statues you can see the picture of that have actually been found. Now, there's much conflict arose between the worship of Ashtoreth and the God of Israel at the end of the period of Judges in the time of Eli and the prophet Samuel. Saul, the first king of Israel, was killed in battle against the Philistines with his 3 sons on Mount Gilboa in northern Israel. The Philistines actually cut off King Saul's head and stripped off his armor. In the first book of Samuel, in chapter 31, verses 9 to 10, it says, "They sent messengers with them throughout the land of the Philistines to proclaim the news in the temple of their idols and among their people. They put his armor in the temple of the Ashtoreths and fastened his body to the wall of Bethshean. The Philistines believed Ashtoreth was mightier than God." Solomon, the 3rd king of Israel, so the son of King David, he married 700 foreign princesses and had 300 concubines. Now, each brought with them their belief in other foreign gods. So King Solomon, as he grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord. Now, in the first book of Kings, chapter 11, verse 3 to 5, it says, "He followed Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians." So here we have evidence of Solomon, who built the temple of Jerusalem to our Lord, was somebody who also became devoted to false gods. Now, his son Rehoboam suffered the consequences of his choices. The united kingdom of Israel was split into 2, and 2 tribes formed the southern kingdom of Judah, whilst the other 10 formed the northern kingdom of Israel. So the influence of the goddess Ashtoreth, or Astarte, as it's sometimes known, remained all the way through until the 15th king of Judah, who was known as Josiah. And he came to rule in 641 BC, some 300 years later. So we can see from that this goddess was worshipped for a very long time. Now, King Josiah, in the 8th year of his reign, began to seek the God of his father David in his 12th year, and he began to purge Judah and Jerusalem of high places, Asherah poles, carved idols, and cast images. You can read about that in the 2nd book of Chronicles, chapter 34, specifically verse 3. So by so doing, King Josiah made it clear that there was only one true God for the people of Israel. Okay, so we're going to move on now to another god or idol, and this time it's one of those very common names which we read in the Bible, and it's the name Baal. Now, Baal is derived from a Semitic word called Baalu. Now, the name of Baal means Lord or Master, and was used for a variety of deities in the land of Canaan. So this word comes from, as it says Semitic. So Semitic language comes from Shem, and Shem, of course, was the son of Noah. And known as the god who created and gave fertility, Baal was often coupled with Asherah and Ashtoreth, but he was also deemed the god of rain and the storm. So when there was thunder in the sky, it was attributed to the roar of his voice. He was also known as the god of justice, and so he was feared by those who committed evil. And then he was also known as a god who was killed by his enemies and fell into the hands of death. So funnily enough, ancient people believed that when Baal was under death's control, that plants would wilt or die and procreation would be stopped. Now the picture there on this page is actually a statue that's found at a place called Ras Shamra, and that's from an ancient city of Ugrut, which is in Syria today. So as the most ancient known rival to God, Baal was the most significant male god to influence the Israelites. When they arrived in the land of Canaan, Baal worship was localized and embodied in many diverse ways. Prior to settling in the land of Canaan, Moses led his people around the land of Moab and camped opposite Jericho, which is in today's Jordan north of the Dead Sea. The Israelite men disgraced themselves in sexual rights with the Moabite woman, and in Numbers chapter 25 verses 2 to 3 it reads, "Who invited them to the sacrifices to their gods. The people ate and bowed down before these gods, so Israel joined in worshipping the Baal of Peor." Later, when King Ahab ruled the northern kingdom of Israel, whom we've already mentioned, he built a temple for Baal in his capital city of Samaria, and he made the worship of Baal the official religion of the northern kingdom of Israel. Altars were set up in all the high places surrounding the hill country, and 450 prophets were made available. In worship to this god, who was credited with the power to create and grant fertility, both male and female holy prostitutes were made available to worshippers in the belief they would encourage fertility in both land and people. Now, animals were sacrificed to Baal at different altars, and prayer was offered up to this god in worship. Prophets who presided over these proceedings on behalf of the people would cut themselves until bleeding. In the first book of Kings, chapter 18:28, it says, "They shouted louder and slashed themselves with swords and spears, as was their custom, until their blood flowed." So a pretty gruesome practice that they did for that false god. Elijah was the only prophet of God at this time, and Jezebel, the wife of King Ahab, had killed all of the other prophets. When he challenged King Ahab over the worship of Baal and asked the prophets of Baal to bring down fire from heaven to burn a sacrifice, they failed. But God's power was recognized when he sent fire to burn the sacrifice Elijah had prepared. So the people of Israel realized at this point in time that they'd been led astray, and Elijah called them to kill the prophets of Baal. This they did, but although they realized there was only one true God, strangely enough, they continued to worship this false god Baal. Now, King Ahab of the kingdom of Judah, King Ahaz, of the kingdom of Judah, it says in the second book of Kings, chapter 16, verse 3, that he sacrificed his son in the fire. So in other words, he was a burnt offering. And the Israelites of the northern kingdom of Israel, they also sacrificed their sons and daughters in the fire as burnt offerings. So this sacrifice of human life was made to appease this god of justice, Baal. The worship of Baal was repugnant to God. Although people sacrificed livestock and made offerings of produce like many religions, the worship of Baal had a much more sinister side, one that included prostitution, self-mutilation, and sacrifice of children by fire as burnt offerings. Now, Baal worship was purged and wiped out in the northern kingdom by Jehu, the king of Israel, and he ruled between 841 to 814 BC. However, he still led the kingdom of Israel in the worship of gold bull calves and failed to keep faith with God. Later, however, when we mentioned before, King Josiah of the southern kingdom of Judah came along, ruling between 641 to 609 BC. He ended Baal worship completely throughout the land of Judah and also through the former kingdom of Israel altogether. Okay, so we're now going to move on to our next false god mentioned in the Bible, and this one's called Chemosh. Now, Chemosh was a national deity of the Moabite people. The Moabites, again, they're in today's Jordan. They're on the opposite side of Israel, on the other side of the Dead Sea. So Chemosh was the national deity or the national god of the Moabite people, and they believe that his name is meant to mean destroyer, subduer, or in fact fish god, funnily enough. Little is known about Chemosh, but he was another god for which humans were prepared to sacrifice their own kind by fire. Now, when the Israelites travelled to the land of Canaan, they fought and defeated an army of Amorites under King Sihon, who occupied the northern region of Moab. The Moabites who had been murdered or displaced by this Amorite king were called the people of Chemosh. Now in the book of Numbers, chapter 21, verse 29, it reads, "Woe to you, O Moab, you are destroyed, O people of Chemosh. He, your God, has given up his sons as fugitives and his daughters as captives to Sihon, king of the Amorites." The Israelites settled into the former Moabite cities for 300 years until the neighbouring Ammonite king laid claim to them. The king challenged the Israelite leader Jephthah, who sent messages with this reply, which you can read in the book of Judges chapter 11, verses 23 to 24. And he said, "Now since the Lord, the God of Israel, has driven the Amorites out of before his people Israel, what right have you to take it over? Will you not take what your god Chemosh gives you?" This makes clear that Chemosh was also the national deity of the Ammonites. Later, during the period of Israelite kings, we can read in the second book of Kings, chapter 3, verses 4 to 5, it says, "Now Mesha, king of Moab, raised sheep, and he had to supply the king of Israel with 100,000 lambs and with the wool of 100,000 rams. But after Ahab died, the king of Moab rebelled against the king of Israel. It was in 853 BC, and King Ahab's son Joram joined forces with King Jehoshaphat of Judah and the king of Edom to quash the rebellious King Mesha of Moab. But when they had him surrounded, he took his firstborn son, who was to succeed him as king, and offered him as a sacrifice on the city wall." This can be read in the second book of Kings, chapter 3, verse 27. Now outnumbered, King Mesha was prepared to sacrifice his own son to Chemosh. This abominable action was enough to change the course of the battle against the three allied armies of Israel. Compared with other deities, there is little information available, but in 1868 there was an archaeological discovery of a stele, which is an inscribed stone, and that's the picture that you can see here on this slide. Now this was made at a place called Dibon, which is the ancient capital of Moab. Called the Moabite stone or the Mesha stele, the inscription mentions, "When he made war against me and Chemosh drove him out before me, King Mesha, who is named as the son of Chemosh, attributes his victory over the Israelites to his God." So this historical inscription parallels the Holy Bible. It mentions the kingdom of Israel, provides the earliest clear extra-biblical mention of Yahweh, and provides perhaps the earliest mention of the house of David. Now, there's much scorn for the worship of Chemosh in the Holy Bible. He's described as an abomination, detestable, and disgusting. It was only a matter of time until those who worshipped him were destroyed. The prophet Jeremiah, who condemned worship of Chemosh, prophesied the Lord would use the Babylonians to destroy the Moabites who worshipped him. And he said in Jeremiah chapter 48 verse 7, "And Chemosh will go into exile together with his priests and officials." This prophecy of course came to pass and can also be historically verified. Now Chemosh was also worshipped by the Israelites early in the period of Kings. In the first book of Kings, in chapter 11 verse 7, it says, "On a hill east of Jerusalem, Solomon again built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab." This did not cease until the reign of King Josiah again. So once again, we have yet another god that was from a foreign country that was actually being worshipped within the Israelite territory of the kingdom of Judah. And of course, it was Solomon who built this high place. Okay, so we're going to move on now to our sixth god that we're going to have a look at. We're going to be having a look at 9 today in this particular lesson. So this particular god was called Dagon. Now Dagon was a fertility god from eastern Mesopotamia, and he became a major northwest god of grain, and that's a symbol of fertility. He was also a god, a fish god, and that's seen as a symbol of multiplying. So you've ever seen the number of eggs that come out from a mature fish? Their numbers are huge, so it's seen as a symbol of multiplication. So he was worshipped by the early Amorites who inhabited Ebla and Ugrit. These are places in today's Syria. Dagon was also the head of the Philistine pantheon, venerated as their national deity. Each of the 5 major Philistine cities had a temple for the worship of this god. The temple statue that portrayed Dagon had an upper human torso and a lower torso of a fish. It is thought that Dagon was never originally a fish god, but important to the Canaanites and the Phoenicians, who were strong maritime nations, his visual image changed, and human sacrifice was also committed in the worship of this god. So on this slide you can see there is a carved stone relief of this god, and on the far side of the slide I've gone to the trouble of recreating that relief and putting colour into there, so you can probably see what it would look like in the actual day, and you can see the sophisticated nature of the clothing that was worn, and weirdly you can see this head of this fish forming like a helmet on the back of this man, and the body of the fish following down the back. Of course, I pray that it wasn't a real fish, because he would have been one smelly chap to encounter. Now, when the Israelites first occupied the land of Canaan during the time of Judges, many of them were married to Canaanite women. They not only disobeyed God, but they substituted their wives' gods for the Lord. And God punished them and let the Philistines rule them for 40 years. During this time, the Philistines set out to fight the Israelites, and they inflicted an initial defeat. So the Israelites brought the Ark of the Covenant to battle, believing its presence would protect them. But the Israelites were beaten, and the Ark of the Covenant was captured and taken to the city of Ashdod, where the Philistines carried the Ark into Dagon's temple and set it beside Dagon. Now you can read about this in the first book of Samuel in chapters 4 and 5. The following morning they found the statue of Dagon lying prostrate before the ark. So they set the statue upright, but again the following morning they found it again was prostrate. However, this time the head and hands had broken off, and only the body was left. So the people of Ashdod and the surrounding territory were then afflicted with tumours. And in 1 Samuel chapter 5 verse 7 it says, "When the men of Ashdod saw what was happening, they said, 'The ark of the God of Israel must not stay here with us, because his hand is heavy upon Dagon, our God.' Consulting with the 5 Philistine kings, they decided to send it to the Philistine city called Gath. When those people are also punished with tumours, they move the ark again, this time to another Philistine city called Ekron. They too suffer from tumours. And then they decide to send the ark back to the Israelites with gifts to pay for their sins. They realise that the end of the plague is not just a circumstance of chance, but an outcome that could only come from a truly living and powerful God. Also, during the time of Philistine rule, God raised up a judge called Samson, who he caused to always seek a female companion from amongst the Philistines rather than his own people. The Lord was seeking an occasion to confront the Philistines, and conflicts arose that caused the death of many of them. God had gifted Samson with superhuman strength, and unable to control him, 5 Philistine kings used a woman called Delilah to snare him. Successfully captured, the kings planned a great celebration, believing their god Dagon delivered their enemy into their hands. In the book of Judges chapter 16 verse 23 it reads, "Now the rulers of the Philistines assembled to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon, their god." Now the Philistines never survived to make a sacrifice to this god, because Samson used his strength to push 2 pillars over and caused the building to collapse, and it killed all 5 kings with all the people within it. It is thought that the great sacrifice was intended to be Samson himself, but the god Dagon was defeated by the God of Israel, and the abominable practice of human sacrifice never occurred. A little bit later, during the reign of Israel's first king, King Saul is wounded in battle against the Philistines, and they decapitate him. And in the first book of Chronicles, chapter 10, verse 10, it says, "They put his armour in the temple of their gods, and hung his head in the temple of Dagon." So we can see with all this scripture, all these ancient gods are very prevalent, and evil things are being done in their name. Okay, so we're now going to move along to the 7th god that we're having a look at out of 9. And this particular god is a god called Molech. Now, it's a name thought to be derived from the word Melech, which means king. Now, Molech was the chief god of the Ammonites, and even though he was worshipped throughout Canaan and Phoenicia, he was associated with life and reproduction, and was often worshipped in conjunction with a fertility goddess such as Ashtoreth. This association led to the prostitution at these places of worship, both between man and woman as well as between man and man. Prostitutes were priests and priestesses, and those who engaged in copulation at worship believed they were making an offering to the goddess. It is thought that the Molech idol was a large, hollow brass statue of a man with a large bulging belly and the head of a bull, designed on the principle of an old-fashioned pot-bellied stove. The belly acts as the firebox, and a child laid on the hands as a sacrifice would roll back into the fire of the belly cavity. The Holy Bible describes this practice as passing through the fire to Molech, and you can find that in the second book of Kings, chapter 23 to 10. In the illustration there beside me, you can see this idol. There's a huge fire that's burnt at the base of it. There's a priest handing over the baby to the arms of this idol, and you can see all the musicians that are playing there to cover up the sounds of the wailing, the screaming of the burning child. So this is an absolutely horrific scene. Now, through Moses, God told the people of Israel before they entered the land of Canaan, "Do not give any of your children to be sacrificed to Molech, for you must not profane the name of your God. I am the Lord." That can be found in Leviticus chapter 18, verse 21. After forbidding the people of Israel to worship Molech by sacrificing their children, God goes further with an explanation of what the penalties will be if they disobey this command. And he says, any Israelite or any alien living in Israel who gives any of his children to Molech must be put to death. The people of the community are to stone him. I will set my face against that man, and I will cut him off from his people. For by giving his children to Molech, he has defiled my sanctuary and profaned my holy name. If the people of the community close their eyes when that man gives one of his children to Molech, and they fail to put him to death, I will set my face against that man and his family, and will cut off from their people both him and all who follow him in prostituting themselves to Molech. Now this is written in Leviticus chapter 20, verse 2 to 5. After giving this command, not only does God provide the required punishment, but says that he will no longer consider anyone guilty as his people, and explains further, "Keep all my decrees and laws and follow them, so that the land where I am bringing you to live may not vomit you out. You must not live according to the customs of the nations I am going to drive before you, because they did all these things, I abhorred them." The strength and specific nature of God's warning against Molech implies that amongst all the other gods, this is the worst. Molech, also known as Moloch, was worshipped by the Canaanites, the Phoenicians, and the Ammonites. The Canaanites and Ammonites were both Semitic people, so they were descendants of Noah's son Shem, and the Canaanites occupied the region between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea before the invasion of the Israelites. The Ammonites lived on the eastern side of the Jordan River, is what is known as Jordan today, and the Phoenicians occupied the area known today as Lebanon and part of Syria, and were renowned as the foremost navigators and traders of the east end of the Mediterranean. So these are all parts of the Levant, and you can see this idol and the worship of this idol was very prevalent in that particular region. Now, forewarned by God, it's easy to understand that the worship of Molech was well established prior to the Israelites' arrival. And sadly, this God, who is referred to as the detestable God of the Ammonites in the first book of Kings, was one of the deities foolishly worshipped by the idolatrous Israelites, who began to sacrifice their own children in the fire. The associated practice of prostitution was also forewarned through Moses when he told the Israelites in Leviticus chapter 19, verse 29, "Do not degrade your daughter by making her a prostitute, or the land will turn to prostitution and be filled with wickedness." Now, there's a historian by the name of Plutarch, who was a Greek historian. He was around between 46 and 127 AD, and he described the practice of a fire god. And he said, "The whole area before the statue was filled with a loud noise of flutes and drums, so that the cries of wailing," and this is talking about the children being sacrificed, "should not reach the ears of the people." History records that both kings and their people sacrificed their sons to appease the anger of the gods. This was usually in a time of danger. Charles Rowland, he examined historical records for many ancient nations, and he wrote a book. And in that book he said, this custom prevailed long among the Phoenicians and Canaanites, from whom the Israelites borrowed it, though forbidden expressly by heaven. At first these children were inhumanely burnt, either in a fiery furnace like those in the valley of Hinnom, so often mentioned in the scripture, or enclosed in a flaming statue of Saturn, known in the scripture by the name of Moloch. The cries of these unhappy victims were drowned by the uninterrupted noise of the drums and the trumpets. So we can see how horrific this practice and this scene was. Now, numerous authors from throughout the ancient Near East described the practice of sacred prostitution that was significant to the Canaanites, but it went much further than performances by the priesthood with each other or with those who came to worship. God made it clear that there was no place for prostitution and worship for the Israelites. So let's read what the ancient Greek historian Herodotus, who lived between 484 and 425 BC, wrote about this practice. This was a practice that was demeaning and disgusting, and it was offensive to God. And it says, I quote, "The foulest Babylonian custom is that which compels every woman of the land to sit in the temple and have intercourse with some stranger at least once in her life. Many women who are rich and proud and disdain to mingle with the rest drive to the temple in covered carriages drawn by teams and stand there with a great retinue of attendants. But most sit down in the sacred plot, with crowns of cord on their heads. There is a great multitude of women coming and going. Passages marked by line run every way through the crowd, by which the men pass and make their choice. Once a woman has taken her place there, she does not go away to her home before some stranger has cast money into her lap and never refuse, for that would be a sin, the money being by this act made sacred. So she follows the first man who casts it and rejects no one. After their intercourse, having discharged her sacred duty to the goddess, she goes away to her home, and thereafter there is no bribe, however great, that will get her. So then the women that are fair and tall are soon free to depart, but the uncomely have to long to wait because they cannot fulfill the law, for some of them remain for 3 years or 4. Excuse me. So you can see this is unbelievable, isn't it? These women are forced to go to a temple and they're forced to have intercourse with any random stranger. And if they don't, they're not allowed to leave. And it says here that those who are beautiful would be in and out pretty quick, but those who were not so beautiful would find themselves stuck in this place for as much as 3 or 4 years. It's just incredible to understand that. So it's easy to understand why God called these pagan religious practices of human sacrifice and prostitution an abomination. It's extraordinary that King Solomon, who built the first temple in Jerusalem for the worship of God and who knew God, was also responsible as he became older for the construction of such a temple, a high place in Jerusalem for the worship of Moloch. And of course, as we've mentioned before, it took another 3 years until the time of King Josiah until these altars in this area for child sacrifice were actually destroyed. Now, the Holy Bible fiercely denounces Moloch, not simply because of the sin of idolatry, but for the odious practice of sacrificing children by fire. The Hebrew prophet Jeremiah describes with horror the ancient rites, telling us that God says, "They built high places for Baal in the valley of Ben Hinnom to sacrifice their sons and daughters to Moloch, though I never commanded nor did it enter my mind that they should do such a detestable thing and so make Judah sin." This is found in Jeremiah chapter 32, verse 35. So whilst Moloch is used as a specific name for the worship of a fire god, the general name used throughout the Bible in the Near East was actually Baal. So that name Baal was often used for this very god as well. Okay, so moving on to the second last that we're going to have a look at in this lesson. We're going to have a look at what's called the Queen of Heaven. Now, the Queen of Heaven was a title that was actually given to many of the ancient goddesses throughout the Near East and the Mediterranean, and also in Egypt. Some of the names was called Anat or Anath, Isis, Inanna, Ashtoreth or Astarte, Hera, and Asherah. Now, this slide there in that picture, it's showing a bronze figurine, and that's a bronze figurine from Syria, and that particular one's called Anat. So that's one of the ones that was known as the Queen of Heaven. Now, the worship of the Queen of Heaven is found in the book of Jeremiah, the prophet. So it's dated at roughly 628 BC, and it's when he spoke of God's disapproval of this female astral deity that was worshipped by the Israelite women in Judah and Egypt during the time of Jeremiah. And in Jeremiah chapter 7 verse 18 it says, "The children gather wood, the fathers light the fire, and the women knead the dough and make cakes of bread for the Queen of Heaven. They pour out drink offerings to other gods to provoke me to anger." So God told Jeremiah of people's disobedience and how angry it made him, saying, "Truth has perished." Now, society had become busy with its own rituals of worship for its own false gods, and although the deity in question is not specifically mentioned, there's speculation concerning which goddess it represents or whether it represents more than one. So perhaps there's a later verse in the book of Jeremiah that answers this, and this is in chapter 17 verse 1 to 2, and it says, "Judah's sin is engraved with an iron tool, inscribed with a flint point on the tablets of their hearts and on the horns of their altars. Even their children remember their altars and Asherah poles beside the spreading trees and on the high hills." So during the time of Jeremiah, there was numerous Jews who fled the kingdom of Judah to Egypt, and settling there, they established a temple to worship God in a location central to the Jewish community at Elephantine. Now, this is in the modern city of Aswan, in the middle. It's on an island in the middle of the Nile River in southern Egypt today. However, they did not keep faith with God as they practiced henotheism. They worshipped God in conjunction with the goddess Anath. So this is also made clear in the book of Jeremiah, which in chapter 44 verses 15 to 18 says, "Then all the men who knew that their wives were burning incense to other gods, along with the women who were present, a large assembly, and all the people living in Lower and Upper Egypt, said to Jeremiah." So here's that comment about to other gods. So we're talking about wives burning incense to other gods. So that's more than one. And so he says to Jeremiah, "We will not listen to the message you have spoken to us in the name of the Lord. We will certainly do everything we said we would. We will burn incense to the Queen of Heaven and will pour out drink offerings to her, just as we and our fathers, our kings and our officials did in the towns of Judah and the streets of Jerusalem." Now you might remember in that previous scripture I said that Judah's sin is engraved with an iron tool. So at that time we had plenty of food and were well off and suffered no harm. But ever since we stopped burning incense to the Queen of Heaven and pouring out drink offerings to her, we have had nothing and have been perishing by sword and famine. Now, this again is from Jeremiah chapter 44, verses 15 to 18. Oddly, being punished for their lack of faith due to the worship of other gods, they go back to their idols and refuse to listen to Jeremiah. They clearly believe that the Queen of Heaven will sustain them. Now, the biblical prophet Jeremiah lived during the latter part of the 7th century and the early part of the 6th century BC. He warned God's people that they were about to be beset by catastrophe. In large because of their worship of other gods in the form of idols, he lived to witness God's prediction when Jerusalem fell to the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar, and Judah's king Jehoiakim was taken into captivity along with many people. Jeremiah gave messages from God to the people of Judah and the last 4 kings. They included Josiah, Jehoiakim, Jehoiakim, and Zedekiah. Throughout the final demise of God's chosen people, he was still warning of the consequence of idol worship. And in the book of Jeremiah, chapter 10, verses 2 to 5, it says, "Do not learn the ways of the nations or be terrified by signs in the sky, though the nations are terrified by them, for the customs of the people are worthless. They cut a tree out of the forest, and a craftsman shapes it with his chisel. They adorn it with silver and gold. They fasten it with hammer and nails so it will not totter. Like a scarecrow in a melon patch, the idols cannot speak. They must be carried because they cannot walk. Do not fear them. They can do no harm, nor can they do any good." So here we have a testament to the fact that an idol is a man-made object, in this case out of wood. It's adorned with silver and gold, but it's obviously a completely lifeless and useless form. Okay, so now we're going to move on to our last slide for this lesson. And on this slide, you can see a picture of this statue of the Greek god Zeus Olympia. Now, Zeus Olympia was a Greek god and was known as the king of gods. And he was deemed to have two children. One was his son called Hermes, who was meant to be the god of merchants and travellers, and the other was Artemis, who was the goddess of wildwood, childbirth and fertility. And they're all mentioned in the New Testament of the Holy Bible. Now, the conquest of Alexander the Great took Greek culture and language throughout the Near East. After his sudden death in 323 BC, because he was short-lived, a period known as Hellenism occurred that brought Greek arts, religion, literature, philosophy and more to the region. Existing cultures accepted the Greek gods, for they believed the gods of their conqueror must be more powerful than their own. When they were conquered, though, nations not always did they switch allegiance to a new pantheon of gods, but sometimes they would assimilate them and they would become synchronized and joined together to form new gods. Now, with the early unexpected death of Alexander the Great, Daniel's prophecy that the Hellenistic Empire would fracture into 4 separate territories came to fruition. And a ruler, this is from Daniel chapter 10 verse 1. Now there was a ruler called Antiochus IV Epiphanes. He was the ruler of one of these territories, and it was called the Seleucid Empire, and I'll be looking at that later on in one of the future lessons. Now he forced Hellenism on the Jewish people in 167 BC and changed the house of the Lord, the temple of Jerusalem, into a temple for Zeus. So you can see here in this slide that there's this massive structure of this false god. And if you look lower down at the bottom, you'll see people walking around. So it gives you an idea of the gross size of this particular idol. Now, this idol was actually placed into the temple of Jerusalem. And you may recall, if you read the book of Daniel, there's 3 different occasions where they talk about something that's called the abomination of desolation. That abomination is this, in the first instance, is the placement of this false Greek god into the temple of Jerusalem, God's holy house here on earth. Now, this was a significant point in history, because at this point in time, the Jewish people, many of them, would stop going to the temple of Jerusalem, and this is the time with the formation of the synagogues as we know them today. Now, the synagogues were basically a local community church in which people came together to read the Torah, to study, to bring up their children, etc., but they no longer went in to the temple. Now, society also splintered in another way, because we had the formation of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The Sadducees aligned themselves with the elite and the ruling class, and they were wealthy, so they syncretized and sort of accepted this Zeus being placed in the temple, whereas the Pharisees, they were aligned with the poor and the greater population of people, and they refused to align themselves with this false god. And they, of course, are the people that we know the best from the New Testament, who are in fact those who persecuted Jesus. Now, they were also the people who were responsible for the oral Torah as well as the written Torah being carried through to this day. So this particular statue was a particularly abhorrent one, and it changed the course of history forever. Okay, so that's a bit of a look at all of these different false gods. I hope that this has sort of given you some sort of a good insight and understanding into the nature of all of the false gods that were around in these times, and you can see the very dark nature of what was happening. People were worshipping the idols, and there was prostitution occurring. There was self-mutilation that was happening, and there was the sacrifice of human life young baby boys and girls to appease an angry God. So these were particularly repugnant to God. So when we look back at these ancient times, it sort of brings to life what it was like during the time of Abraham and for many generations that came after them. Now, looking back at these ancient times, we can see how terrifying and influential the temples and high places were with their loud music, their priesthood, their sacrifices, and prostituted fertility rites. They clearly believed the worship of other gods could make their lives better. The God of Israel, however, was only known by a single ark, the Ark of the Covenant, an ark that was drawn around by a cart and worshipped in a tent. Later, when the house of the Lord was built in Jerusalem, carpenters throughout the land fashioned gods with chisels from wood, while blacksmiths forged idols by the might of their arm. Kings anointed by God in heaven led their people to worship gods made by man here on earth, and yet despite all of this, and despite the distance of time, the humble worship of our God, without images or idols, without prostitution or sacrifice, has not just survived, but triumphed over all. So I'm going to draw the lesson to a close at this point. There's very much more that I could say on this subject matter. I just pray that you've been able to get a very good sense of some of these abhorrent ancient practices. I'm just going to change over to the next slide, and I just want to bring to life what it was like to live in these ancient times. I just want you to understand that there was these abhorrent practices that were going on during the time of Abraham all the way through to Christ and beyond. And in fact, when we come into the modern day age, this is still a problem to this very day. And if you don't believe me about all these pagan practices, just go to your Google search engine on your computer or on your phone and type in the word pagan and see what happens. The last time that I did it, 13,700,000 entries became available. Now, in the book of Romans, in chapter 1, verse 21, it says, when people don't want God, their thinking becomes futile and their foolish hearts are darkened. For me, I've just got to jump in my car. I can drive around the local neighbourhood and you can see this prevalence of statues and idols made by man that are in people's gardens. People want to believe they'll bring them a sense of peace and good fortune. People rub the belly of Buddhas. They adorn statues with garlands of flowers. They burn incense. People wear good luck charms. They believe in daily horoscopes. They call psychic hotlines, and they practice various forms of superstition and witchcraft. Now, whether these things bring fulfillment or not, by not accepting God's truth, they leave themselves prone to believing in a lie and ultimately reject God. Now, in the New Testament era, Paul addressed this in his letter to the Romans when he said that they exchanged the truth of God for a lie and they worshipped and served created things rather than the Creator. So for many of us who believe in the same God, the God of Abraham, we have become embattled, often in a bitter fight, over the validity of our belief. However, for people who reject God, if they don't want the truth, they'll simply believe a lie. Those who worship false gods in what may seem to be harmless fun, or those that commit acts of atrocity in the name of God, should be most concerned about the complete havoc they threaten their lives with when they turn their back and abandon God. In each religion there are those who condemn others for their beliefs, but as a follower of Christ, a Christian, I believe in our eternal God, but so do others. The difference is the path to salvation. As Christians, we don't only believe in obedience to God's laws. The story of humanity, especially the disgusting practice of idol worship, demonstrates we're incapable of complete obedience to our God, who despite our shortcomings has never stopped having faith in us. He showed his ultimate faith to his chosen people, the Jews, when he kept his promise to their ancestors through the birth of his Son, Jesus Christ. As Christians, we believe Jesus made the ultimate sacrifice for our sins and that he is with us always by the presence of the Holy Spirit. The choice of Jewish people not to believe that Jesus Christ is the Messiah changed the course of history. No longer was God only the God of Israel, or further back the God of Abraham. He's now the God of Gentiles, the God of all. So the Holy Bible records history that shows that people have abandoned God and have been guilty of atrocious acts. The worship of ancient gods illustrates this very clearly. For many people in modern society, it seems easy to feel they no longer need God and that there is no harm in worshipping whatever they choose. Mankind has become so clever that it can manufacture its own needs. But can this really be true? Wars continue to rage around our planet. Crime and death is a constant companion. We cover all manner of material comforts and technology, and we live our life for the love of material wealth rather than for spiritual well-being. Our husbandry of the planet is so poor that we now face natural disasters that are predicted to grow in number and intensity. But surely fundamental belief in God will get us through this. In the book of Genesis, the first book of the Bible, God made a covenant with Abraham's descendants through his son Isaac. We can trace Jewish history in the Hebrew Bible back to Abraham through Isaac. And because Jesus was born of Jewish parents, the development of Christianity can be traced through the same scripture in the Old Testament of the Christian Bible. The fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy, however, the specific nature of the birth, life, death, and resurrection of the Messiah can only be found in the New Testament concerning the life and teachings of Jesus Christ. So an irrevocable genealogical path leads us from Abraham to the birth of Jesus Christ, a path that reveals why the world needs Jesus Christ. This is why my book and this teaching is called A Journey to Faith, and the subtitle says, Why the World Needs Jesus Christ. So I thank you for joining me on today's lesson. I pray that you have enjoyed it. I pray that you've gained some insight and understanding into the practice of idol worship and the problem that it causes to us to this very day. The purpose of this is to bring light to the time of Abraham and those who are going to come after him as I take you on this journey. And I just want you to have a good understanding that as we talk and we read about these gods in the Bible and what people did in the name, I pray that this lesson has been able to give you a good guideline and an understanding of who they were, what they actually did, and what the consequences for those actions were. So I thank you very much for joining me on this lesson. God bless you all, and I look forward to seeing you when we come back to the next lesson in this series. God bless you.